Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of July 3rd. I'm still Michael James, and our next guest is someone I've known probably since around 1976 when we were starting the Heartland Cafe. He's named Jeffrey P. Smith, and he was born in Chicago's Loop. I first knew him when he was involved, or at least I remember this, with the McGovern campaign way back. He did go to Loyola. He went to Northwestern and Harvard Law School. He's long time been a kind of community organizer with a legal bent, done a lot of stuff around Illinois law. And I ran into him at the Main Street Art Fair up in Evanston on Saturday past. And we had a nice chat, and we remembered how much we enjoyed talking with each other. So I said, how about coming on the radio show? And he said, no, certainly. And here he is. So, Jeff, I'm not sure what we're going to talk about, but I'm sure it'll include some stuff about patriotism and the 4th of July, talk about the presidential election, local elections, Illinois law, Supreme Court. We'll see where the conversation goes. Take it away, my brother.
Anything we say will end up in a data center in Utah, right? And we don't want those files to be boring, right? So
we'll liven them up. Let's go.
Well, you had asked a question, and I saw something about this in it was either the Times or Bloomberg, some national press today about should we even still be celebrating the 4th of July? Are progressives going to sit this one out? A lot of folks are. A lot of people feel bad about America one way or the other. I think we've got record high numbers, and this was true under Biden, but it's continued true under Trump, of people who feel like America's going in the wrong direction. So maybe people don't feel like getting out and waving the flag, right? So
yeah, I'm not waving the flag, although on certain days I'll hang it up.
Well, everything to some degree is relative. One of the things I've done in the 5 or 10 minutes of spare time I have a week is some genealogy over the past 20 years. And one of the reasons I found out I couldn't find out much about my dad's side was because my great grandfather was sent to Siberia twice, once under the Tsars. And then when the Bolsheviks came in, they sent him to Siberia too. So, neither of us are being sent to Siberia right now, except maybe metaphorically. And, it's still a country where we have the opportunity to change things. And the Declaration of Independence was really revolutionary for its time. It's easy to judge it by 2026 standards, but in 250 years ago, the law of conquest was what prevailed. You had kings and queens, emperors, khans, chieftains, sultans, and whoever could take anything and suppress and bully anybody else pretty much did it. And the idea of abolishing slavery was certainly not in currency anywhere on the globe to speak of. And folks claimed divine right. So the idea that government derived from from the consent of the governed, and that people had a right to modify or even cast off their government entirely, and that they were endowed by either God or natural right with inalienable rights that government couldn't take away, was pretty radical for the time. And that document ended up really changing the world, not just the United States, but you look at most democracies and you look at their founding documents and you'll see DNA of either the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution or both. And the fact is, we're not going to change the world by doom scrolling on our phones or pressing buttons and saying like. Okay, you got to get out. And one of the things that we need to do is to say that patriotism cannot be claimed by just one party or one faction. If you do that, we lose the symbolism. The idea of America is one of change. That's why the Constitution talked about a more perfect union. That's why Dr. King talked about a long arc of moral justice. And we got to keep there fighting. And that's how you and I met. And we got to stick with it, and we got to be grateful for the fact that we have what opportunities we can to do that in this country. So I'm going to be out on the 4th of July. I'm going to be playing Rock and Roll on a Float in the Evanston 4th of July parade. All of your listeners are welcome to not only come up to the parade, but to march with the Central Street Neighbors Association if they want to.
Well, it's really a hot one out there, but I might make it up that way. While you were talking, I remembered a couple of things. I'm not sure they're appropriate, but I did have a great-great-grandfather named Stetzer who was wounded at Gettysburg. His wife came down with cookies, and whatever they did when they went off, the bullet came out, is the way the story goes. I remembered while you were talking, walking up and down the Wilton Road in my hometown, singing John Brown's Body Lies a Moldering in the Grave. And, I was a big supporter of all things U.S. I think when it first began to waver a little bit, or at least I had some concern, was when Kennedy came to Mexico in 1962, and I was down there, and I was all about Kennedy then. And all of a sudden I saw these signs on the wall that said, Kennedy, largate, get out. And that was as a young guy at 20 years old when I first started to learn about U.S. imperialism and some of the negative stuff. So anyhow, enough of that. What's your take on, I know this is way off, but the possibilities for the presidential candidate from the Democratic Party before we get into some criticism of the Democrats? Or go ahead and mix it up.
Well, you're assuming that I had a good friend who would say every election cycle that we're not going to have any more elections.
No, I don't believe that. I think we will have elections.
I think we will. The Democrats will nominate somebody. We hope they'll choose wisely.
We do.
As much as I would like to see more choices and more channels for people to be active, other than the duopoly that we've got, the realistic chance, unless something changes dramatically in the next 24 months, is that you're going to have a Democrat or a Republican. I think that's the likely thing, unless you see, there's a possibility that the disaffected of both parties might try and form something in common. If you and Marjorie Taylor Greene sit down together, right?
I'll bring you along.
But big question. The Democrats supposedly did an autopsy, and they tried to keep it secret. Have they really learned any lessons? Do they really understand why they lost? Trump, by a lot of measures, was the weakest candidate that the Republicans could have fielded in 2016, and broke world land speed records for a terrible administration his first term. And how does he end up getting elected, and then, like Grover Cleveland, 8 years later, getting reelected? There has to be some self-assessment. I don't think it's enough to say, "Oh, the American people are bad and stupid." I think that's a cheap way out. Okay, that you have to take some responsibility. I do. Having run for office, there's always externalities you can't control, but the one thing you can control, you hope, is yourself. And I'm not sure that the Democrats realize what they've done wrong and what they need to do. I would like to see somebody, and this has been a theme of mine for as long as you've known me, that appeals to the commonality of Americans, what we have in common, the big issues on which there's broad consensus. You were speaking just before I came on about, offshore wind and the buyback of those leases. Well, before Trump got into office, I was seeing polls showing that 67% of Americans, a lot of Republicans too, thought that we ought to be doing more for renewable energy. We've got an insatiable appetite for electricity right now, and it's only going to get larger. The thrust for fossil fuels is on the wrong side of history. And, we've got to come around to that. A greater and better healthcare. Nobody much likes the healthcare system. Obamacare, I'm not going to sit here and bash Obama, but there's an argument to be made that it perpetuated an insurance industry, that it basically acted as a parasitic middleman, and adds to the cost and adds to the frustration. We don't have maybe as long waits as they do in Great Britain, but I know people that can't get to an MRI approved without a 2-month wait, and you can walk in to one of these places without a prescription if you want to do it uninsured and pay cold cash on the spot. But our system's messed up, and we're an outlier in the Western world in terms of that. So there's some big, broad items, I think, that are winners for the Democrats. And I'm not one to advocate centrism for centrism's sake. I think on some issues, the Democrats could win by being more progressive. On others, though, and in particular, I think cultural and the so-called wedge issues, that where you don't have broad consensus of the American public, that's where you don't want to be the tip of the spear. You're a sports guy, so I think they call that leading with your chin in boxing.
Well, speaking of sports, this transgender thing with the Supreme Court for a couple of states is an issue that the Democrats took on last time, and it's not a winner. We'll save that for another day. But, one of the things that's going on in the Democratic Party is younger, more progressive, or even, social democrats, democratic socialists have been winning election. As our friend Mike Klonsky pointed out in a newsletter today, Milat Kiros upset primary win over Representative Deanna DeGetti in Colorado, part of this insurgent pattern, where we have younger left-wing insurgents knocking off older Democrats. I think that can be really good in a lot of cases. On the other hand, it could go overboard in certain ones, and we might lose. You talked to me a little bit about the bankruptcy of both political parties. Take it away.
Well, we could have had a similar situation in the 9th Congressional District, where both you and I live, had Kat Abou-Ghazaleh simply taken on Jan Schakowsky one-on-one if Jan had not announced her retirement. And it would have been interesting to see how that played out. Folks vote to some degree on identity, right? And there's right or wrong. There's this meme that over a certain age, you're meat, right? I think of Anthony Quinn in Savage Innocence, and you can't chew the pemmican anymore, so we're going to toss you out in the snow. Rahm Emanuel's out there running for office, saying that nobody over 70, 75 ought to be able to hold office.
Yeah, he'll get there quicker than he thinks.
Yeah, I know. He's squeaking in under the radar, and he just doesn't want any competition from folks who are a couple years older. Your question, the bank. I don't know that both parties that either party is bankrupt.
Those were your words to me.
Okay, well, I'll own them then. If not bankruptcy, then maybe they should at least be put in receivership. Maybe it's Chapter 11, not Chapter 7, or the other way.
That's good. That's good.
So
having experienced Chapter 11.
Yeah, no. So you need a reorg. But I think there, you've got a third of the electorate that doesn't identify as either, and arguably, a plurality. And so-called independents, while they don't all think the same, collectively constitute, maybe the biggest group of voters. So both parties are doing something wrong. And part of that is the primary process. What you've got to do to get to be the nominee is in the Republican Party, tack to the right, and to the Democratic Party, tack to the left. And especially in a multi-candidate race like we just saw in the 9th Congressional District. I'm not saying that happened here, but, you might win or lose by only a little bit. And so you can't afford to tick off, Personal PAC, the Firefighters Union, and I'm not singling these guys out for any,
good example.
Sierra Club, anybody. And you end up with a smorgasbord of issues that doesn't hold together as a collective whole. You've got positions that don't really even bind to each other. You lack unifying principles, and again, you're leaving out a lot of folks who don't necessarily buy into the most extreme articulations of positions, and that's a lot of America. And so then it all gets compounded, of course, by gerrymandering, political spending, et cetera. You can't talk about the parties in a vacuum without talking about the landscape that they have to operate in. But it's I think we need to open up more channels in order to get the parties themselves to be more representative of a greater group of people. Having folks who represent 25% of the population get in and every 4 years completely change things around and do things that 75% of the public doesn't agree with isn't a recipe for a sustainable society.
Any thoughts on those channels that you mentioned?
Well, right now we're seeing, the Chicago Tribune's been running a number of editorials on how we need more independent candidates and how tough it is. Look at what happened down in Chuy Garcia's district. And both you and I have supported Chuy in the past, but I thought, it was an evasion of the process,
it was
what he did. And, to have to gather 10,000 signatures when to run in primary, only need, a fraction of that is grossly unfair, especially when they put a maximum on it. Okay. I've taught ballot access, at election law at Loyola. And, it was always a rule of thumb that you had to gather 3 times as many signatures as you needed, because you knew that people were going to sign with the wrong address or forgot where they'd registered, et cetera, et cetera. But at minimum, 50% over. But they have a maximum that's less than 50% of what you need. I think it's only about 10 or 20% over the minimum. So you've got a very narrow window. Virtually every signature you submit has to be good. And what campaign has the resources to sit and vet 10,500 signatures? It's grossly unfair, and it artificially limits the choices that folks have, and it makes it so that the primary becomes the entire race, and that's not healthy.
Jeff Smith, we have a couple minutes left, and I could either leave it to you to pick something you'd like to share, or you did mention housing. You said you could talk a lot about housing, and I know a bill for housing just was held up by the president. What's your take on housing?
Well, that's a huge.
We'll have you back on that, but just a little teaser.
It's a huge, huge subject. People have been talking about a housing shortage and a housing crisis for 100 years. Okay, when we sent all our young men over to World War I, no housing got built for a while. Everybody comes back and is competing for jobs and a scarcity of housing. And that's part of the reason you had the unrest. Everything from the Palmer raids and anarchist movements to race riots. Okay, in the period right after World War I, we've been building roughly 1.5 million on average to 2. Let's call it 1.5 million on average new units of housing in this country since the late 1960s. It goes up to 2 million sometimes it goes down to 1 million. We've kept on building. I think it's more of a demand problem than a supply problem. I'm very wary of things that are called reform, like zoning reform, when they're coming originally from the same folks who hated the New Deal, who wanted to give us tort reform, who wanted to give us regulatory reform. The housing bill had strong bipartisan support, but is it really a good idea to say that a 6-story building doesn't need to have, a fire escape or a second set of stairs? Is it really a good idea to say we're not going to apply the Environmental Protection Act to housing? How is that environmental justice? We're going to give, we're going to put affordable housing on the site of a former dry cleaners where the soil is full of perchlorate. That's not right. So it's a very complicated and nuanced subject that I think is being oversold in a lot of respects. And you've got to do a deeper dive than we've done, and a deeper dive than the abundance theorists have done on the real drivers of demand, and how one size doesn't fit all.
Jeff, I got one more minute. Got anything you'd like to share?
Well, we need to fix politics. We need to fix our system. There's been a series of unfortunate Supreme Court decisions going back to Citizens United, that gerrymandering has been now completely okayed. Racial gerrymandering, in effect, has been okayed by the Louisiana versus Clay case. The Supreme Court just yesterday doubled down on Citizens United by allowing unlimited spending by political parties. I'm working on, I think you can't fix these without a constitutional amendment, because the Supreme Court is saying this is what the Constitution, says. And unfortunately, as great a document as the Constitution was, I don't think it foresaw some of the forces that we now see operating in our economy and technologically. So we've got to get up to speed on that. And I think there's a lot of things like eliminating gerrymandering completely, eliminating all forms of discrimination and anything having to do with voting or politics. And I would say even going to a paper ballot. I see support for that from both sides of the political spectrum. I'd like to see some of our folks in Congress move forward on a holistic constitutional amendment to restore democracy.
Jeff Smith, you're a great guest. I'm glad we ran into each other at the Evanston Main Street Fair, and I'm inviting you back publicly here to come on the show next month with whatever you'd like to talk about.
Anytime, Michael. And just remember, there's a lot of countries where you and I couldn't say the stuff we're saying, on a podcast.
My country, 'tis of thee. Okay, brother, power to the people. We'll see you. Everybody else.